Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin, daf Yud Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Jill and Jeff Shames in memory of Avi Moli, William Baker, Zev Velvel Ben Chana Beruven on his second yahrzeit. Dad, still missing your loving embrace. Your memory is a blessing. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started on a quick review of where we ended yesterday. So we saw a Mishna on daf Yud Amud Bet that any shtar that was done in a gentile court works even if they're signed by Gentiles, but not for get and emancipation document of a slave. Rabbi Shimon says, no, even that works. Okay, and then we tried to figure out, and then we had this line, which we have to figure out today, which is, Lo uzkaru ela bizman shenasu behedyot. Only if it was done by a hedyot, a regular person, is it a problem, but in a court, it's totally fine. So let's go through. Again, review. If it's regular money documents, well, of course, if it's done in the court, they have their name to stand up to. They're not going to lie. What's the problem with get and shikor eved? Well, they're not part of that whole, like this is a more Jewish thing, the gentile slaves that kind of work in your house, become part of your family and become semi-Jewish, right? When you free them, they become Jewish. That's a whole unique Jewish concept. So is get, right? Obviously, there's divorce, but this type of the way to do a get is a uniquely Jewish thing. So there, Gentile signatures don't work. However, Rabbi Shimon thinks they work. And why do they work? And then we explained at the bottom of the daf yesterday, they work because it's really not that they work. It's that we hold like Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Elazar, the Edim Asir Karta, we actually hold that way also. It's important the ones who see the get being given. It's not so much the importance of the signatures on the shtar. What about Rabbi Elazar? What about Rabbi Abba, who says that Rabbi Elazar agrees that Mezuyaf Mitocho Shu Pasul, if you have disqualified witnesses, it doesn't work? That's only because we're worried that maybe you'll rely on them. Maybe, okay, there's two issues of why you might rely on them. Either you won't have Edi Masira around and you'll just say, oh, the Chatimot are good, which would be a problem if they're Gentiles. And Rashi actually says here, the very last words in Rashi on Daf Yud Amud Bet, if you have disqualified witnesses signing the shtar, we're worried that maybe we'll use them to actually give the get. Maybe once they're signed, maybe we'll say, oh, you could be the same ones to also write. It's like at the wedding. If somebody signs the ketubah, you might use them for Eidei Kiddushin, who stand up under the chuppah and say, oh, you're married, right? I see that you gave her the ring and you're married. So the whole issue here is that we're worried that you might actually rely on those witnesses. So then how could that possibly be? If they're Gentile witnesses, it's a problem. To which they answer, and that gets us to the top of our daf, b'shemot mufakim. It's names that are so clearly Gentile that there's no way anyone will think it's a Jew, in which case, if no one's going to think it's a Jew, then obviously you're never going to rely on them. You're not going to use them as Eidei Masira. And if we can't find the Eidei Masira, you're not going to say, oh, we have a document with signatures, all is good. Because clearly no one's going to think we can rely on that. And that's why it even works for getting a Shimonship or Avadim. To which the Gemara asks right now, which I told you yesterday, we're going to ask this question, what are names that are clearly Gentile names? Now, you might be expecting certain names, but no, that's not what you're going to hear. Amar Papa Kegon, Hormiz, Vavudayna, Batshivta, Barkidre, Ubate, V'Nakimuna. Okay, names that obviously were popular in those times. Maybe Hermes is a name you've heard of, but none of the other names we've ever really heard of, at least I never did. But in those days, obviously, those were popular names. Low. So now we're going to say that infers if the names are not clearly Gentile names, they're Gentile names, but it's not clear that only Gentiles have those names. Some Jews have those names also, right? Most of us who live abroad, for example, many of us have English names and Jewish names. Right? My name, Michelle, is definitely not a Jewish name. I have a Jewish name that I don't even use. Nothing to do with Michelle. It's a Hebrew name, right? So I have a Hebrew name and an English name. So so now we're going to say if there's a name that could be Jewish, could be Gentile, so we're going to assume it's no good. Well, if that's the case, the Mishna should have mentioned it, right? Notice what the Mishna does mention and what the Mishna doesn't mention. Adatani Seifa, because the Mishna then says, again, assuming this line is Rabbi Shimon, let's just go back to the Mishna. Rabbi Shimon says, even these are good. Lo huzkeru ela b'zman shenasu behedyot. It's only if they're done with a hedyot that it's a problem, okay? Which sounds like, so now, it's saying this only works in the case where it's from a court, not if it's from not from a court. Well, should have said there. Also, if there's a distinction between Shemot Muvakim and Shemot She'em Muvakim, if they're telling you it works in Erkaot of Gentiles, courts of Gentiles, but it only works if it's a clear Gentile name that no Jews have that name. Well, it should have said, in what case are we talking about? Only if it's clear names that only Gentiles have. But if it's names that are not mufakim, then it shouldn't work. And it didn't say that in the Mishna. So to answer that question, we're going to have two answers. One is to change the wording of the Mishnah, which we do often. Hachinami kamar, in other words, so is usually a last resort. Well, that's really what it says. Add these words into the Mishnah. When does this work? If it's shem mufhak. It's as if it was done like a hedyot and it's disqualified. Meaning, if it's done by a hedyot, of course it doesn't work. If you did it with names that could be Jews, could be Gentiles, and we don't know which it is, then there's a concern that, again, what's the concern? That maybe people rely on it, and maybe it really was a Gentile name, and therefore it's going to be a problem. And therefore it's treated like it wasn't done in a court, and it's actually disqualified. And that's how they reread the Mishnah. So that's one way to explain that line. But another way to explain that line is to detach that line from Rabbi Shimon and say that that's not actually Rabbi Shimon speaking. Rabbi Shimon says in the Mishnah, Af eluk shirim. These are also fine as long as they're shemot mufakim, okay? And it just doesn't mention, but that's what it means. Then, Lo's kuru ela b'zman shenasu b'hedyot is not talking about get nashim and shechor avadim. It's talking about the other kind of shtarot, all the other ones, like a sale, where, what's the difference? There, the signature is used just as a proof document, right? So, ibayit ema seifa atan legite mamon. Some people say that line is talking about monetary documents, not get and emancipation documents. V'hachi kama, and this is what it says. Lo's kalum gitei mamon de psulim ela b'zman shenasu b'hedyot. When they say the gitei mamon de psulim, it's specifically when they're done with a regular person. Because again, why do we trust the court when they're bringing this proof document? We trust the court because the court isn't going to write a proof document if it wasn't really true. But if it's a hedyot, he doesn't have that same sense of, what if I lie? It's not as big a deal, although we'll see later, maybe some disagree with this. But that line is talking about regular documents are only if they came out of a Gentile court, but not if regular Gentiles just signed them. We don't trust them. Time. Now we're going to have Rabbi Elazar says, Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, Kach Amar Rabbi Shimon l'chachamim b'tzaydam. We're now going to have another more elaborate version of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said to the rabbis, he was arguing with them about this point. Again, let's just review. The rabbis said we can accept Gentile courts for monetary documents, but not divorce or emancipation. And Rabbi Shimon said it's accepted across the board. Okay, and we're assuming now it's accepted across the board. Again, there was this debate about the hedyot. Maybe all of them are only accepted if they're done in a court, but not individuals, or maybe the individual part was referring to, right, only part of the statement, not the whole thing. Anyway, we'll leave that aside for right now, but I wanted to point it out because here we're going to have some other way of understanding the hedyot. So Rabbi Shimon said to the Chamim in Sidon, that's a place which is now in Lebanon, Lo nechleku Rabbi Akiva v'chachamim al kol hashtarot ha'olim be'arkaot shel avdei kochavim. The rabbis and Rabbi Akiva in the previous generation, the one right before Rabbi Shimon, says they all agreed that shtarot that come out of a Gentile court, all shtarot, okay, we're going to say this now, even Gittin nashim and shechorei avadim, even though they're signed by Gentiles, if it came from a Gentile court, everyone agreed to that. Okay, he's basically saying to the rabbis, you're wrong in thinking to make this distinction, because everyone in the previous generation agreed that that's not a problem. So if so, then obviously, if he's pointing out Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, they must have disagreed about something. Their debate was only if it was outside the court. And now we're going to see that there's a debate about outside the court. Rabbi Akiva machshil, v'chachamim poslim, chutz migitena shev'shechor avadim. Let's start from the end. Gittin nashim and shechorei avadim are even permitted behedyot. Why are they permitted behedyot? Because, again, we're not relying on them for anything. We're relying on Edi Masira. So the fact that there's Gentiles signed, it doesn't make a difference. Now, again, you can assume, and this commentaries point out, some of them anyway, that we must be talking about Shemot Mufakim, because if they're not Mufakim, we're back to square one, and that we don't know if it's Jew or Gentile, and that's more of a problem, because maybe they'll rely on them, and maybe it turns out they're a Gentile. But if it's clear Gentile name, it doesn't matter, court, not court, it'll be accepted, because in the end, we're relying on the Edim that saw the get being given to the woman, which was the most important part. We call the Rabbi Elazar. But what's their debate? Well, if the document of the monetary document was done by a hedyot, Rabbi Akiva says, Machshir, we trust the hedyot also. Any Gentile has his reputation on the line. He's not going to sign a document unless it's true. And Chachamim Poslim, they say, no. Only a court, an individual, we're suspicious of. And then we have a third. Okay, so they don't disagree about this, right? They all agree that that if it's done in erkaot, it's fine across the board for everything. They disagree about hedyot when it comes to monetary. They still all agree about get, even if it's a hedyot, a regular person, that it's fine. Rashbag omer, af elu ksherim b'makom she'en Yisrael chotmim. He says this is only true though when we say it's all fine and good. It's in a place for the get neshachor eved where Jews don't generally sign documents. Then we can assume, and this maybe shows maybe it's not Shemot Mefakim, but if Jews don't sign documents, now Rashi says, what do we mean by this? We mean it's a place where the Gentiles don't allow Jews to sign documents. They don't. They just say, you can't sign documents. So if that's the case, then we're going to assume it's obviously a Gentile. But if it's a place where the Jews sign, then it's more of a problem. Okay? So now, because then again, we're back to square one. We don't know, is it a Jew or is it a Gentile? So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. If we're going to distinguish between places and say a place like this, it's okay. Place like that, it's not okay. Well, then we have a question. They say, if it's a place where they don't sign, well, then you should make a gzera and say, even though Jews don't sign here, if we allow it here, you might come to allow it in a place where Jews do sign. So maybe we should forbid it. To which they answer, Shma b'shma michlif. Okay, people might confuse names with other names. And if we allow certain names, you might come to confuse and think other names are okay. And that is a problem. But atra ba'atra, and therefore we're going to forbid. But atra ba'atra lo michlif. But we're not going to have people confuse this location and that location. If things are done differently in this town and they're done in that town, we can understand that there's distinctions in the law. And we're not going to say just because it's permitted here, it's permitted there. That kind of thing we don't worry about. There were Arameans who had this ad hoc court. It wasn't a real court. It wasn't erkaot. It was an ad hoc court. Knufiyah is when they get together. In Hebrew, right? A knufiyah is a gang. That's where people gather together. So here, he wanted to permit it in this group of people that got together to make an ad hoc court. Rafram said, no. It has to be something formal. Here you see, now the question is, what are they referring to? Some people say they're referring to the mammon according to the rabbis. In other words, because we already said, get nashim and all that is even fine if it's not erkaot. So maybe what they're referring to is monetary documents where we said it has to be done in a Gentile court according to the rabbis against Rabbi Akiva, who said even if it's not in a court. But in other words, again, the rabbi said it had to be done in a court. So what does court mean? Court means they generally hold court there and not that they decided one time to have an ad hoc court. Amar Rabbi gives an example now. Hayshtar parsa demaslinia le'ba'apesa de Israel magbina le'b'mibnei chach. And maybe it wasn't a particular case, but he says if there was a shtar written in Parsi, Persian, and it was given in front of Jewish witnesses, again, Edei Mesirah, okay, so you owe me money, and you pass the shtar to me saying I owe you in front of two Jewish witnesses. But the document was written by Persians and presumably signed by them, Persians. Magbina me. I can then collect the money from free property. What does free property mean? Free as opposed to mishuabad, which is property with a lien on it. Okay, what does that mean? This means that if you owe me money and if we did it balpeh, orally, I can only collect from free property. Free property means property that's in your possession right now. So I can only take it from property that you have. But if we had a shtar written out in general, not a shtar parsi, because shtar parsi is going to be different. But if we have a regular shtar, a regular document, the IOU, signed by Jewish witnesses, given in front of Jewish witnesses, all's good, I can go collect that money. And it's from the moment of the document, any property that you have in your hands at the time of the document, if you sell to somebody else, I can demand it back from them. Let's say I go to collect the money and you say, I don't have any money. Well, I can go take any property that you had in your possession at the time of the loan that you sold to somebody else. I can just go to them and say, listen, this is mine. How does this work? Well, it works based on the fact that you might say that's very unfair to them, but when they bought the land, their job is to check, is there any lien on the property? And the assumption is that once there's a shtar, and that's why there has to be a shtar, if it was an oral agreement, there's no way they would necessarily know. Once there's a shtar, there's an assumption that yesh lezeh kol, people know. People hear about these things, word gets around, because word gets around, the person has a way to find that out. So when they go to buy the land, let's say the land is worth $1 million, they're going to buy it for less money because they're going to say, but look, you have a loan out with Michelle and maybe she'll collect it from me. So you're going to end up buying that for $900,000, let's say, because you're going to say, look, that land is worth less than what it really is, because I might end up, getting this land taken away if you don't pay back your loan to Michelle. So that's the way the whole thing works with Nechasim Shu'abadin. Now they come here and they say, Rava says, if it's a shtar Parsi, though, a Persian document written in Persian, but Jewish witnesses watch the transaction, if you give it to me, well, I can collect the money, but only from free property of yours. Okay, so it's valid, but limited. So now they want to understand why. So the first thing is, why is it valid at all? V'halo yad al mikra. But the Jews can't read Persian, so they don't even know what's written in it. So how could they serve as witnesses to this transaction that went on when they have no idea what it even says in the document? B'diyad, it must be a case where they know Persian. Okay, obviously, there were Jews who knew Persian in those days. But wait, there's two other issues, which is there's rules about documents of Jews, that we have rules in our courts that the Persians clearly don't have those same rules. Now, what are they? Well, both are to prevent forgeries. What are we worried about? If you give me the document, the IOU, and I keep it in my possession, if it's parchment that I can erase, I can change. Instead of 400 shekel, I can change it to 800 shekel, right? I can erase it and fix it. So you need it to be written in a way that it can't be forged, which means you have to treat the parchment in a particular way, almost like maybe a shellac. You would put this gall on it, and that would make sure that you can't erase. To which they answer, why are you assuming the Persian document doesn't have it? You could say this would only be if it was a Persian document that they did this. They treated it with the gall. Another thing they did to prevent forgeries. The document was generally written with the signatures at the bottom. Now, sometimes there was empty space. Now, what's the problem with empty space? Once the document's in my hand, I could write in all sorts of things if I wanted. Even if it was treated and I couldn't erase, I could add a whole nother line. So the rabbis said, any shtar has to have that space filled in by a summary of what the top part said. And the Persians don't do that in their documents. So again, how can I demand the money? Maybe I'm lying. Maybe I added some extra line. To which they answer, b'dimahad. Again, it would be a case where they added the text in. They did do that. Okay, and then there's no concern. To which they say, okay, well, if this document is number one, the Jews understood what they were reading, right? What was in the document when they watched the transaction happen. So they're good witnesses, and the parchment is treated properly, and the concern for forgery of adding another line is not there. Well, then it should be a perfectly good document. In which case, the other direction is I should be able to collect it from even lien property because it's a perfectly good document. Why are we limiting my ability? First, they wanted to know, why can I even collect it? Now they're saying, why are we limiting my collection of it? And let's say you don't have the money, I'll be stuck. Late kala. Well, the reason is things that come out of Persian courts don't get around. The Jews know what goes on in the Jewish courts, but there's the rumors aren't spread. The word doesn't get around about this kind of thing. And the whole idea is that when your friend bought the piece of land from you, they needed to check what the story was, and they would have no way of knowing if it was, they're going to check every Persian court also, besides all the Jewish courts. They would have no way of knowing. And therefore, that's why I can't collect from lien property, because if you don't know there was a lien on it when you bought it, well, then it's unfair for me to collect it from you. We're going to have two versions of what Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan. The first version is the following. You'll find this interesting, I think. Turning now to Amud Bet. Edim achatumim al haget, ushmotehen kishmot ovdei kochavei mal. What if there's witnesses signed and their names that are like Gentile names, but also Jews have those names? So now we have people signed on a get. Okay, what's interesting is nowadays, if many of you live abroad, and even if you don't, you know people with English names and Hebrew names. And Generally, when they sign on official documents like a ketubah, Jewish documents, they're going to sign with their Hebrew name, not their English name. But here it seems like people maybe didn't have two names like we do nowadays, or even if they did, they went by their Gentile name when they signed on documents. So now we have witnesses signed, and their names are Gentile names, but they could be Jewish names, and we don't know. So what does he say? Now here comes the fascinating thing, because if we know, if there's a shtar with Jewish signatures, obviously it's a good shtar, right? We're talking about, let's say, a get. The get is totally fine. On the other hand, if we have Gentile names that we know are Gentiles, it's also fine because we're not worried we're going to rely on the signatures. So we end up with, right, the two extremes are clearly fine, but the suffix in the middle becomes a problem. If we're not sure if it's Jew or Gentile, we get stuck because it could be then you might end up relying on the signatures and it could be they'll end up being Gentiles. So that's where we actually get stuck. It's very fascinating because if we know for sure they're Gentiles, no one will rely on them. And actually it's totally fine. The problem becomes when we're not sure what it is. So again, your suffix, your doubt case is actually more strict than both if we knew what it actually was, it would be fine either which way. But yet the case of doubt is strict. This happens once in a while. So now that's what he wants to know. The only two names that we permitted was Lucas, which means wolf, or Lus, which means lion. Okay, but they were names of people. Lucas sounds like Luke, right? Which are clearly Gentile names. Jews don't have those names. No Jews go by those names. But other names that could be Jews, could be not, that we can't do. And that's exactly for what I explained before. To which Eitive, Rish Lakish questions him, wait, that was your answer, Rabbi Yochanan? But it says in the following Tosefta, Gittin ba'im medinat hayam, gets that come from abroad, ve'edim chatumim alehem, and there's witnesses signed on them, afa pisha shmotehem keshmot ovdei kochavim ksherim. Since they come from abroad, and there's a get, but we assume what? We assume who's likely signed on a get? A Jew. And since Rov, now here we go by the majority, Rov Yisrael shebachul shmotehem keshmot ovdei kochavim, most Jews who live abroad, they have Gentile names. Therefore, since chances are a get was signed by a Jew, and since even though the name is Gentile, we assume most Jews there have Gentile names, you can assume it's fine. But, right, and that's because, right here you see, specifically you can rely on it. And Rabbi Yochanan had answered Rish Lakish, you can't rely on it. Right? You can't assume majority of people, their names are of the chavin. To which they answer, there it says it's based on this principle of Rov, the majority of people there. But notice, now it doesn't say that continuation here, but the assumption is Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish were living in Israel. And there you can't assume that most of the people, right, like you have nowadays, most people in Israel, their names are not Gentile names. Sometimes you meet some people with non-Jewish names, but most of the time it's Hebrew names. So the idea is that we're going to distinguish in Israel when you have it, there's more of a chance it's Gentile, and therefore it's more of an issue. If it comes from abroad, where right, again, we can assume it was probably, it must be probably signed by a Jew, and the fact that most of them have Gentile names, you can assume by majority rules that it's fine. Okay, and that's the distinction they make. Some people say that actually Rish Lakish's question was specifically the issue they brought up in the Tosefta, that if the get comes from afar and is Adim, what, right, with a non-Jewish name, can we assume it's Jewish or not? To which he answered Pashat Leimi Matnita, and he answered him from the Tosefta that yes, it's fine because of the Rov. And then he's only dealing with that. It wasn't a case where there was a question on something else. He answered it and then raised a question from the Tosefta, but he actually asked the question in the Tosefta, and then Rabbi Yochanan said, oh, it's an explicit Tosefta, and here's your answer. New Mishna. Now we're getting into a bit of a different topic. The husband sends a get to his wife or an emancipation document to his slave, and he sends it with a messenger. That's called the shaliach holacha. He's a messenger that's supposed to deliver it to the woman. The woman herself can send the shaliach kabbalah. She could send a messenger on her behalf to accept the get. And once her shaliach kabbalah accepts the get, it's a done deal. The question is, when the husband gives it to his shaliach to send, is it already as if it's hers? Now, why would we assume it's hers already? Well, there's a principle that if you send me a gift with someone else, I don't even know the gift is coming. As soon as you give that gift, you actually can't change your mind. And that's going to be the big question here. At what point can the husband change his mind or not? Is it once he gives it to the messenger, he can't change his mind? Or is it once it gets to me or my shaliach Kabbalah, he can't change his mind? So the issue has to do with a principle that comes up by gifts, which is if someone gives a gift to me, right, that it's good for me, zachin l'adam shelo b'fanav. Once you give that gift to the messenger, it's mine because that messenger can acquire it on my behalf because it's good for me. But if they're giving you something that's bad for me, it's only until it gets to my hands that it's mine. Okay, that's the principle. Zachin l'adam shelo b'fanav. You can do it for a person if it's a zchut, if it's good for them, even if they're not there or don't know about it. Ve'ein chavin l'adam shelo b'fanav. But we don't do something that's bad for them unless it actually gets to them, or in this case, if she sent her own messenger, then it would also be as if she accepted it. So the Mishnah says, "Ha'omer tnu gets elishti." So here's the case: the man makes a shaliach holacha. He appoints a shaliach to bring the get to the woman. Ushtar shechor zel avdi, or an emancipation document to his slave. Rabbi Meir says neither of them is accepted until it actually gets to the woman, or again to one of her messengers that she sent to accept it on her behalf. Meaning it's not at all accepted. But Chachamim omrim b'gittin nashim avalo b'shechurei avadi. Beget, in a get case, it's not a get until she gets it. But in an emancipation document, as soon as you give it to the shaliach, the person is free. Why is that? Because you can do good things for a person when they're not there, but not things that are a chov for them, that create an obligation for them or something bad. So why is a divorce bad for a woman, but an emancipation document is good? Well, if you want to decide you don't want to feed your slave when he's your slave, you actually can do that. But you can't decide not to feed your wife. So therefore, when you emancipate the slave, he gets his freedom. And it's not like you're making him lose out, because if you didn't want to give him food when he was a slave, you could have. So the fact that now he doesn't get food from you isn't really a loss. It's only a gain, which is his freedom. Now, the woman might gain her freedom, but she loses the food, and that's money. So it's a monetary problem for her to get the get, because she's actually losing out on the daily food that she'd be getting for the rest of her life while she would stay married. So Amar Lahem, Rabbi Meir says to them, what are you talking about? Why did Rabbi Meir say the husband can still change his mind? Because he views this as a chov for the slave also. Because, for example, if it was a Kohen who owned the slave gets to eat truma as long as he's the slave. But as soon as he emancipates the slave can't eat truma anymore because he's not part of the Kohen's family. So just like the wife can't eat truma, also the slave can't eat truma, and therefore the slave should also be considered a chov. And you shouldn't be able to, right, just by giving it to the messenger, the messenger isn't zacheh, on his account. They said no. That's an indirect result. It's not a direct result. What happens? Why doesn't he get the truma anymore? Because he only gets the truma because it's considered the property of the owner. Once he's freed, he's no longer the property of the owner, and therefore he doesn't get the truma. But it's very indirect. It's not a direct result, and therefore that's not considered a chov. Okay, it's not considered an obligation for him. Now the Gemara tells a story. Rav Huna and Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef were sitting in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah become nominated. There's a bunch of stories like this. Rabbi Yirmiyah falls asleep. In the meantime, the rabbis continue their discussion. Rav Huna says, Shema minami d'Rabbanan, from the opinion of the rabbis in this Mishna, we distinguish between the woman and the slave. And the slave basically gets his freedom right as soon as the husband gives the shtar to the messenger. You can learn from here how to face the Baal Chov Kana, a different halacha, but somewhat related. If you owe me money, and my friend comes along and goes into your possession and takes the money that you owe me, seizes it for me. So from here you can learn similar, it's different, but since they can take it, right, even against, right here, they can basically take the money and acquire it on my behalf. Okay, that's coming out of this concept of zachin l'adam shelo b'fanav. Basically, even if I don't know about it, they can take something that's good for me from you. They can intercede on my behalf, take it from you, just kind of like, it's a little different, but kind of like the slave, the messenger. The messenger takes on behalf of the slave. And even though the slave doesn't even know it's coming his way, it's valid. So therefore, sounds like you can go take money from someone who owes me money for me. That's what Rav Huna said. But wait, is that true? Can my friend Jane, let's say, go take money from you that you owe me when you actually owe money to Joe and David as well? Okay, now, because when Jane takes the money from you, she's actually creating a loss for Joe and David, potentially, because maybe you don't have enough money to return to everybody. And then by her taking from me, that causes a loss for other people. So when she's doing just good and it's just for me and that's fine, I'm the only one, of course, but can she do it also when it causes others a loss? To which, right? Because theoretically, if I take the money myself, I could see that could cause a loss to Joe and David because that's me. But can I send a messenger that causes, or can they do it without my knowledge and cause a loss to somebody else? It's actually a very interesting question. To which they say, right? So Amar Le'im, he says, yeah, also that. Now, in the meantime, Rabbi Yirmiyah wakes up, somehow heard what they were talking about, even though he was sleeping. Amar Lehu, he says to them, Daridike, Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He says, children, like you don't know what you're talking about. This is Rabbi Yochanan saying. If you take money for someone else, in a case where there's other people who are obligated to get money back from them, who are owed money, that doesn't work. And if you want to prove from our Mishnah doesn't prove anything. Why is that? Because when he said tnu, give this get, that's as if he's saying the word zichu, acquire it on her behalf, or take it, right? Well, again, it doesn't work for the get because it's not a zichu, it's close. But it works for the emancipation because he says the word tnu. It's like saying zichu. That's different. If he says, and if I give someone something and I say, acquire this on behalf of somebody else, then even in a place where chav lachirim, of course it's going to work. But, right, that's not the same as someone else who just comes and randomly takes it. These are not the same cases. So he disagrees. Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda now says, and this is something we're going to argue about tomorrow in tomorrow's class, but we'll finish up with this. You want to know what the answer to this question is? Can they take it on my behalf without my knowing about it when there's a loss to Joe and David? Well, it's a machloket Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanit, and their machloket has to do with a charity case. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishna, the corner of the field is left for the poor people. Let's say someone goes and collects for me. I'm poor. They go and collect and they take from me. Now, the idea is the poor people are supposed to go and take their stuff. What if someone else collects? Now, obviously, when they collect it from me, they're causing a loss to all the other poor people who could have collected it for themselves. Now, they won't get it, right? I always think of this example of saving a parking spot, right? Saving a parking spot for someone always seems unfair. It's true you got there first, but you got there first by foot, not by driving. The way parking spots work is whoever gets there first gets it. Same thing with payah. Whoever gets it, gets it. Now, if someone takes for you, that's almost like cheating. It's not exactly fair. Again, there's two sides of the story. Someone might say, what do you mean? We got here first, we're saving the spot. It's fair. So it's a good question. So they say here, so he collects the payah and says, this is for, I'm collecting this for Michelle. Rabbi Eliezer says this works even though it's chav lachirim. And Chachamim say, no, it goes to the first poor person he finds. Okay, you can't, right, we're assuming this person wasn't poor, and he has to give it to the first poor person that shows up. You can't save it for other people. Okay, very interesting question. So with that, we're going to finish. Tomorrow they're going to say, is this really one and the same? Anyway, right now, just to do a quick review, first we dealt with Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah and what exactly he holds, and how that last line, is it Rabbi Shimon or is it referring back to the rabbis, and it's talking about Gittin Mamon and not Gittin Nashim, right? Shtarot of monetary shtarot and not get of a woman, and how we understood the issue of the Hedyotod. And then we saw a Braita again, which kind of expanded exactly on what they're debating, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, in which cases exactly, and what his argument was against the rabbis. Then we had Shtar Parsa'ah, right? We had the Shtar of the Persians, and whether, right, would that work and why would it work? But yet it only works to collect from free money, not free money. Again, that was all monetary issues. Then we went back to this question, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, what do we do about names that could be Gentile, could be Jews? We talked about the fact that the Safek case is actually worse than both Vadai cases. If it's definite, it would actually be okay in both cases, both extremes, but the middle case where it could be either or is actually more problematic. And then we actually had two versions of what Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, whether we distinguish between Israel and outside of Israel or not. And then we had this Mishna about give this get to my wife, give my slave, and the difference between chavin and zachin adam shelo b'fanav. And then can we infer from there to topis the Baal Chov? And can we infer topis the Baal Chov if you collect for a creditor, even if it causes a loss for others? Does that work as well? And we saw different opinions about that. And perhaps it's a machlok at Rabbi Lezer and the rabbis. We'll continue with that in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, and a Shavua Tov if you're already up to that.